All right. Oh no, where'd the presentation go? 1 minute for technical issues. Let's try this again. Better, but not quite. Not better. Perfect. Here we go. All right, let's do this. Hey, everyone. Thank you very, very much for being here today. Thank you to the organizers for having me. I am Cheeky, and I'm here to talk about the Protocol Guild. But before we talk about that, let's kick things off by looking at this beautiful image here. I got it from the Ethereum.org website. It's very pretty, right? Do you think that it represents Ethereum well? Do you think that if you showed this picture to your non-crypto family and friends, that they would be able to understand what Ethereum is all about? Probably not, right? But I bet that if I were to ask 10 of you what Ethereum is, I would get at least 5 different answers. Don't worry, I'm not actually going to ask you. But I bet that some of you might describe it as an infinite garden. Others might call it ultrasound money. Someone might say it's a settlement layer. And God forbid, one of you might even say it's Bitcoin plus smart contracts. But you know what? You wouldn't even be wrong. And that kind of raises the question, is it really possible for Ethereum to be all those things at the same time? I would say yes. It's absolutely possible for it to be all those things at the same time. Ethereum can be described in so many different ways because it can be used in so many different ways. And to that extent, we can kind of think of Ethereum as a commons, like forests or fisheries. What is a commons? It's a shared resource, an area that is accessible to and used by the public. To quote Trent Van Epps, Ethereum as a commons is such a useful frame. Anyone can contribute. Anyone can see the constraints directing labor. Anyone can use or produce the shared resources. Unfortunately, as with all commons, this resource can be abused. And of course, I'm talking about the tragedy of the commons. And so that's why I got a picture of Moloch here, the god of sacrifice. There he is, sacrificing some children. We like to use Moloch to represent coordination failures, of which, of course, the tragedy of the commons is one. Now, in Ethereum's case, the tragedy that we have is that there's a relatively small set of core protocol contributors who are relatively underpaid, yet they're responsible for securing billions in values via the infrastructure that they maintain. And that's exactly what Amin is tweeting about here when he says that one of the most important coordination problems facing Ethereum today is the tragedy of the commons that exists around funding core protocol development. Said another way, existing funding mechanisms for Ethereum's core protocol development only provide a fraction of the financial incentives that are otherwise available in the ecosystem for similar work. And to visualize this, we have this beautiful chart here. You can see Ethereum's core protocol development at the bottom left, low risk, low reward. But perhaps more importantly, you can see how by just moving a little bit up the risk spectrum, you can dramatically increase your rewards. For example, by working for a large crypto project like an exchange or a layer 2. And this is really bad, guys, because it essentially means that Ethereum's core protocol development is not economically rational on a risk-adjusted basis. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because, quite frankly, some of Ethereum's core devs are absolutely the smartest people in the world. They're working on some of the hardest problems in the world, and they have unbelievably specialized knowledge that so many crypto projects would love to pay a ton for. Why does this matter? Well, because Ethereum is very, very far from being done. Over the next 5 to 10 years, there's a slew of unbelievably exciting upgrades planned for the protocol, and obviously the community expects these upgrades sooner rather than later. So to get through the surge, the scourge, the verge, the purge, and the splurge, it is imperative that we're able to onboard and retain Ethereum's talented core protocol contributors for the long term. So this brings us to this big question. How can we rebalance financial incentives to make Ethereum's core protocol work economically rational on a risk-adjusted basis? So let's brainstorm. What about relying on altruism, people donating out of the goodness of their hearts? And sure, there's a lot of examples of that in Ethereum. If you follow Vitalik on Twitter, you may know that up until recently, his Twitter bio used to say, "I will not send you ETH." But that did not always used to be the case. Here's a tweet thread from back in 2018 where Preston Van Loon of the Prison Client team is bemoaning the lack of funding for his client. Vitalik replied, "YOLO," and sent him 1,000 ETH, which at the time was worth $100,000. Today it's worth like $3 million or more, 3.5. Who's keeping track? But of course, can we rely on that? Absolutely not. It is not sustainable over the long term. We also don't know if we can trust all these donors. They might have ulterior motives, might ask for something in return. And of course, it's also very narrowly targeted. Not all core contributors are on Twitter bemoaning the lack of funding, so it's hard for donors to surface that need. Okay, what about making Ethereum's holders pay for Ethereum's core protocol development? Well, that was actually proposed. This EIP from 2020 to give a portion of block rewards to these core protocol developers. Of course, it was rejected by the community for not being value aligned. Ethereum is about giving power back to the people. It is not about core devs inserting a paycheck for themselves into every single block. It's also really hard to change. If we implement this and then regret it, it's hard to change. We need to be very thoughtful about the kind of changes we implement into the protocol. And of course, it's a slippery slope. If we set a precedent that we're happy to fund a certain group of people with a block subsidy, then who's to say that another group of people don't pop up and say, "Hey, unfair, fund me too." So there's got to be a better way. What about establishing social norms around funding Ethereum's core protocol work? Here we have a tweet from Danny Ryan back in October of 2021. And he called to make it a social norm for all DAOs and other network tokens building on Ethereum to allocate 1.5% of their tokens to the individuals building and designing the L1 infrastructure they rely on. Now, this is a great idea for many reasons. First of all, it gives exposure to the individuals, not to teams. It gives those individuals access to the ecosystem upside. I'm talking about the financials, of course. It has a relatively low risk of capture, assuming that this really is a social norm that's adopted by the ecosystem. Similarly, it can thus be sustainable. It would be a cost borne by projects, not the holders or the users. And depending on how it's distributed, it could be credibly neutral. But of course, we're missing a piece of the puzzle. How would you distribute that funding? Imagine all these projects were willing to donate their tokens to support Ethereum's core protocol development. How would you distribute it? Can we rely on existing public goods funding mechanisms to distribute this? I'm sure you're all aware of these amazing public goods funding programs, and they all do a lot of different things in their own great way. For example, the fact that they're accessible to different types of grantees, they have regular schedules that grantees can rely on, and of course they take on the operational overhead of running these kind of programs. But even they have all wildly different ways of distributing, quadratic voting, badge holder voting, whatever else. And none of those are necessarily tailored to the complexities of distributing to Ethereum's core protocol developers. So let's take a step back. What we want to do is establish a social norm that projects built on Ethereum help to fund the core protocol work that they depend on. Something needs to happen in between, which will result in we rebalance incentives for this work. What's missing? A distribution mechanism which distributes that funding in a way that's sufficiently fair, in a way that remains accurate over time, and keeps Ethereum's credible neutrality. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the Protocol Guild. And to understand the Protocol Guild, you need to understand its two components, a list and a funding mechanism. Now, what is this list? Quite simply, it's a membership registry of Ethereum's active core protocol contributors. Who are these contributors? Well, those are all their names. There's 167 of them today. In fact, one of them is sitting over there. Shout out to Pooja. But their names aren't super helpful, are they? So let's talk about what they actually do. Broadly speaking, their work is targeted at three groups, either client development, research and implementation experiments, and then spec work, testing, security, infra, and coordination, essentially support work that supports the other two. Here are some examples of teams that do this work. You've probably heard of client teams like Geth, Aragon, Nethermind, and Besu. You've probably heard of coordination teams like Ethereum Cat Herders. You've probably heard of the Robust Incentive Group. But Protocol Guild's membership is centered around individuals, not teams. So if you're working on, for example, biz dev in the Nethermind client, you would not be eligible. Now, I also said that it's a list of active core protocol contributors. So let's quantify what I mean by active. To be eligible for membership, you have to have contributed for at least 6 months continuously. But on average, with the 167 members that we have today, they have contributed an average of 3.4 years of their lives to Ethereum's core protocol work. The oldest member has been around for over 9 years, which means, yes, he's been there from the start. As a collective, Protocol Guild members have contributed 560 years, which is why we can safely say that the Protocol Guild is a collective of the individuals who are stewarding Ethereum's core protocol. But you might be wondering, how is this list maintained? Who updates it? Well, it's actually the Protocol Guild members themselves. And if you think about it, this makes the most sense because the vast majority of people don't have the necessary context or expertise to both track who these contributors are and see if they're still contributing or not. They don't have the necessary context. But Ethereum's core protocol contributors, i.e. these Protocol Guild members, they have all the necessary domain expertise. They know their peers. So by them being responsible for curation, we have the highest assurances that this list remains accurate both now and in the future. And in a couple of weeks, we'll be launching our V2 contracts, so we'll have a Mog V3 DAO to instantiate these membership decisions on-chain for greater transparency. What is the net result of this? Well, we've essentially made the entire set of Ethereum's core protocol contributors directly legible on-chain. But you might be wondering, how does that rebalance incentives? Well, because we've built, of course, a funding mechanism around this list. So let's talk about the funding mechanism. There's 3 unique properties to this funding mechanism. The first is how donations are handled. We've provided a single Ethereum address that anyone can use to donate directly to all 167 members. So we've taken away all the complexity associated with having to figure out who to donate to if you want to support this work. Of course, by being on-chain, it's completely transparent. You can see who has donated and who is receiving these funds. But what happens to funds that are donated? Well, the donation address is actually an immutable vesting contract that trustlessly vests funds over 4 years by default. Why 4 years? It obviously provides long-term incentives to keep these contributors hanging around. Why did I say 4 years by default? Well, if you want to make a sizable donation and you think it should vest for longer than 4 years, go ahead. Deploy a 10-year vesting contract and have it point the vested funds to this membership registry. But that brings us to how these funds are actually distributed. Does every Protocol Guild member get an equal share? No. We thought long and hard about this. How can we distribute it in the most neutral way? And we ultimately landed on time as the measurement of impact. And so, broadly speaking, the longer you've been contributing, the higher your share of donated funds. This mechanism is also neutral because whatever tokens are donated, they are vested and distributed in kind. They are never swapped to ETH or stables or anything else. So for all these different reasons, we think it's fair to say that the Protocol Guild's funding mechanism is simple and transparent while creating strong incentives to onboard and retain these contributors over the long term, and thus enables Ethereum's ecosystem to fund its dependencies. And that last part is really important because it brings us to the Protocol Guild Pledge. Has anyone heard about the Protocol Guild Pledge? I expect to see more hands next year. But it's okay. This was announced very recently. Here is Tim Bako announcing the Protocol Guild Pledge. I highly suggest you check out his Mirror post for all the juicy details that I will not have time to cover. But very high level, the Protocol Guild is a commitment by projects building on Ethereum to donate 1% of their native tokens to the Protocol Guild. Now, you might have some questions. Why native tokens? Why 1%? Why take the pledge at all? So let's run through it. Why native tokens? Well, because we want to give these core protocol contributors a basket that represents the diversified exposure to the value being created in Ethereum's ecosystem that is supported by the infrastructure that they're building. Of course, some of these tokens also grant rights such as governance, so it's potentially a good way to get these contributors involved in your project. But of course, please don't expect anything in return when you donate to the Protocol Guild. Why 1%? Well, because not everyone can make a $10 million donation, right? Small projects cannot, maybe. But they can make a 1% donation. It's also very easy to pledge. You don't need to know what your market cap is, what the value of your token is. You can make this pledge before you even have a token. It abstracts volatility. If you were to make a donation in a bull market, it's probably going to be worth less in a bear market, but a 1% donation is always worth 1%. And perhaps most importantly, we believe that 1% is more or less sufficient if we can get approximately 1/3 to 2/3 of the projects building on Ethereum to take the pledge. But why would they take the pledge? Well, number one, to fund their dependency. If you are building on Ethereum in any way, you have a dependency on it. It might be for data availability, it might be for uptime, whatever else. By taking the Protocol Guild pledge, you are helping to rebalance incentives to ensure that these talented core protocol contributors stick around to keep maintaining and upgrading the protocol that you depend on. It's also a great way to make Ethereum more resilient by providing another diversified funding stream that is more capture resistant. And of course, it also scales Ethereum's values. Public goods are good. We love public goods in Ethereum. Taking the Protocol Guild pledge is a great way to embody that. Remember this graph here? Not super nice when it's not economically rational. Obviously, we believe that if we can get projects building in Ethereum to take the pledge, that we can change that and make Ethereum's core protocol development economically rational, and thus slaying Moloch in the process. And would you believe it, we've already had some projects that have taken the pledge. Shout out to EtherFi, PwnDAO, Tyco, Credit Guild, and Member for being the first 5 people or 5 projects to take the pledge. How did they take the pledge? It was very simple. They tweeted about it. Also Farcaster. Here are some examples of their tweets and casts. But of course, giving credit to these projects is really important. So that's why we've updated the Protocol Guild's June dashboard to track these pledge takers, and we plan on releasing an NFT that we can give to projects who have donated 1% of their token supply. What if you don't have a token? What if you're not a project? Well, not a problem, because if you're not aware, the Protocol Guild has actually been around for 2 years already. And the Protocol Guild pledge has only been around for like 3 weeks. And so in the last 2 years, we've actually received almost 5,000 donations, totaling $14 million in value, which is actually worth around $30 million today. And so on the left, you can see our donor leaderboard. It's composed of an amazing array of different projects in the ecosystem. And you can see how the bottom half of that table is actually projects and individuals donating ETH because they don't have a token. And yes, individuals. There's 2 individuals on this list. Shout out to Tetranode and Anthony Sassano for being unbelievable supporters of Ethereum's core protocol development. And if you're wondering, where is Optimism on this list? Wasn't the Protocol Guild the top recipient in the last 2 RPGF rounds? Yes, we were. We haven't finished KYCing yet, so we haven't gotten those funds yet. The last thing on this slide, as you can see there, to date, in the last 2 years, because of all the fundraising, we have been able to distribute approximately $115,000 on average to every single Protocol Guild member. Now, that's an unbelievable start. It's a fantastic proof of concept, but it's clearly not enough to rebalance financial incentives. And that's exactly why we've launched the Protocol Guild Pledge, to encourage projects building on Ethereum to take the pledge to help make Ethereum's core protocol work economically rational on a risk-adjusted basis, and thus help secure the future of Ethereum's core protocol development. Thank you very much.